Part 28 of Gray's Anatomy, Part 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Morgan Scorpion. Anatomy of the Human Body, Part 4 by Henry Gray. 5e. The Trigeminal Nerve. Nervus trigeminus, fifth or trifacial nerve. The trigeminal nerve is the largest cranial nerve and is the great sensory nerve of the head and face and the motor nerve of the muscles of mastication. It emerges from the side of the pons near its upper border by a small motor and a large sensory root, the former being situated in front of and medial to the latter. Motor root. The fibres of the motor root arise from two nuclei, a superior and an inferior. The superior nucleus consists of a strand of cells occupying the whole length of the lateral portion of the grey substance of the cerebral aqueduct. The inferior or chief nucleus is situated in the upper part of the pons, close to its dorsal surface, and along the line of the lateral margin of the rhomboid fossa. The fibres from the superior nucleus constitute the mesencephalic root. They descend through the midbrain and, entering the pons, join with the fibres from the lower nucleus, and the motor root, thus formed, passes forward through the pons to its point of emergence. It is uncertain whether the mesencephalic root is motor or sensory. Sensory root. The fibres of the sensory root arise from the cells of the semilunar ganglion, which lies in a cavity of the dura mater near the apex of the petrous part of the temporal bone. They pass backward below the superior petrosal sinus and tentorium cerebelli, and, entering the pons, divide into upper and lower roots. The upper root ends partly in a nucleus which is situated in the pons lateral to the lower motor nucleus, and partly in the locus coeruleus. The lower root descends through the pons and medulla oblongata, and ends in the upper part of the substantia gelatinosa of Rolando. This lower root is sometimes named the spinal root of the nerve. Medulation of the fibres of the sensory root begins about the 5th month of fetal life, but the whole of its fibres are not medullated until the 3rd month after birth. The semilunar ganglion, ganglion semilunare, Gasseri, Gasserian ganglion, occupies a cavity, cavum Meckelii, in the dura mater covering the trigeminal impression near the apex of the petrous part of the temporal bone. It is somewhat crescentic in shape, with its convexity directed forward. Medially it is in relation with the internal carotid artery and the posterior part of the cavernous sinus. The motor root runs in front and medial to the sensory root, and passes beneath the ganglion. It leaves the skull through the foramen ovale, and, immediately below this foramen, joins the mandibular nerve. The greater superficial petrosal nerve lies also underneath the ganglion. The ganglion receives, on its medial side, filaments from the carotid plexus of the sympathetic. It gives off minute branches to the tentorium cerebelli, and to the dura mater in the middle fossa of the cranium. From its convex border, which is directed forward and lateralward, 3 large nerves proceed, viz., the ophthalmic, maxillary, and mandibular. The ophthalmic and maxillary consist exclusively of sensory fibres. The mandibular is joined outside the cranium by the motor root. Associated with the 3 divisions of the trigeminal nerve are 4 small ganglia. The ciliary ganglion is connected with the ophthalmic nerve, the sphenopalatine ganglion with the maxillary nerve, and the otic and submaxillary ganglia with the mandibular nerve. All 4 receive sensory filaments from the trigeminal, and motor and sympathetic filaments from various sources. These filaments are called the roots of the ganglia. The ophthalmic nerve, nervus ophthalmicus, or first division of the trigeminal, is a sensory nerve. It supplies branches to the cornea, ciliary body and iris, to the lacrimal gland and conjunctiva, to the part of the mucous membrane of the nasal cavity, and to the skin of the eyelids, eyebrow, forehead, and nose. It is the smallest of the 3 divisions of the trigeminal, and arises from the upper part of the semilunar ganglion as a short, flattened band about 2.5 cm long, which passes forward along the lateral wall of the cavernous sinus, below the oculomotor and trochlear nerves. Just before entering the orbit, through the superior orbital fissure, it divides into 3 branches, lacrimal, frontal, and nasociliary. The ophthalmic nerve is joined by filaments from the cavernous plexus of the sympathetic and communicates with the oculomotor, trochlear, and abducent nerves. It gives off a recurrent filament which passes between the layers of the tentorium. The lacrimal nerve, nervus lacrimalis, is the smallest of the three branches of the ophthalmic. It sometimes receives a filament from the trochlear nerve, but this is possibly derived from the branch which goes from the ophthalmic to the trochlear nerve. It passes forward in a separate tube of dura mater, and enters the orbit through the narrowest part of the superior orbital fissure. In the orbit it runs along the upper border of the rectus lateralis with the lacrimal artery, and communicates with the zygomatic branch of the maxillary nerve. It enters the lacrimal gland and gives off several filaments, which supply the gland and the conjunctiva. Finally, it pierces the orbital septum and ends in the skin of the upper eyelid, joining with filaments of the facial nerve. The lacrimal nerve is occasionally absent, and its place is then taken by the zygomatico-temporal branch of the maxillary. Sometimes the latter branch is absent, and a continuation of the lacrimal is substituted for it. The frontal nerve, nervus frontalis, is the largest branch of the ophthalmic, and may be regarded, both from its size and direction, as the continuation of the nerve. It enters the orbit through the superior orbital fissure, and runs forward between the levator palpebrae superioris and the periosteum. Midway between the apex and base of the orbit it divides into two branches, supratrochlear and supraorbital. The supratrochlear nerve, nervus supratrochlearis, is the smaller of the two, passes above the pulley of the obliquus superior, and gives off a descending filament to join the infratrochlear branch of the nasociliary nerve. It then escapes from the orbit between the pulley of the obliquus superior and the supraorbital foramen, curves up onto the forehead close to the bone, ascends beneath the corrugator and frontalis, and dividing into branches which pierce these muscles, it supplies the skin of the lower part of the forehead close to the middle line, and sends filaments to the conjunctiva and skin of the upper eyelid. The supraorbital nerve, nervus supraorbitalis, passes through the supraorbital foramen, and gives off, in this situation, palpebral filaments to the upper eyelid. It then ascends upon the forehead and ends in two branches, a medial and a lateral, which supply the integument of the scalp, reaching nearly as far back as the lambdoidal suture. They are at first situated beneath the frontalis, the medial branch perforating the muscle, the lateral branch the gallia aponeurotica. Both branches supply small twigs to the pericranium. The nasociliary nerve, nervus nasociliaris, nasal nerve, is intermediate in size between the frontal and lacrimal, and is more deeply placed. It enters the orbit between the two heads of the rectus lateralis and between the superior and inferior rami of the oculomotor nerve. It passes across the optic nerve and runs obliquely beneath the rectus superior and obliquus superior to the medial wall of the orbital cavity. Here it passes through the anterior ethmoidal foramen and, entering the cavity of the cranium, traverses a shallow groove on the lateral margin of the front part of the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone, and runs down, through a slit at the side of the crista galli, into the nasal cavity. It supplies internal nasal branches to the mucous membrane of the front part of the septum and lateral wall of the nasal cavity. Finally, it emerges as the external nasal branch between the lower border of the nasal bone and the lateral nasal cartilage, and, passing down beneath the nasalis muscle, supplies the skin of the ala and apex of the nose. The nasociliary nerve gives off the following branches, viz., the long root of the ciliary ganglion, the long ciliary, and the ethmoidal nerves. The long root of the ciliary ganglion, radix longa ganglii ciliaris, usually arises from the nasociliary between the two heads of the rectus lateralis. It passes forward on the lateral side of the optic nerve, and enters the postero-superior angle of the ciliary ganglion. It is sometimes joined by a filament from the cavernous plexus of the sympathetic, or from the superior ramus of the trochlear nerve. The long ciliary nerves, nervus ciliaris longi, 2 or 3 in number, are given off from the nasociliary as it crosses the optic nerve. They accompany the short ciliary nerves from the ciliary ganglion, pierce the posterior part of the sclera, and running forward between it and the choroid are distributed to the iris and cornea. The long ciliary nerves are supposed to contain sympathetic fibres from the superior cervical ganglion to the dilated